Okay, guys. So this session, I think people are still. Can you all mute yourself, please? Those who are on Zoom, please mute yourself. Okay, guys. So this session is very important because we are going to discuss the spinal cord tracts. We are going to talk about the pathways of these sensory and motor tracts. So first half is on sensory tracts, and then the second half of or the second hour is on the motor tracts uh, or descending tracts. So anywhere you find lost or you find that you don't understand, stop me, because this is the real build-up of the neuroanatomy. This is the point where you are building up the neuroanatomy component. So any confusions, any problems, any misunderstanding, just stop me there. We can go very slow on this because once you understand these pathways, it would be easy for you to understand the lesions. Okay, so last time we discussed the different ascending and descending tracks. So within the ascending tracks, if you see, there are three major groups. One in the posterior column, which is the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. And we said these tracts are responsible for two-touch discrimination, vibration, and conscious proprioception. So this is the function of the posterior column tract, and there is no motor tract in the posterior wide column. The posterior wide column, only sensory tracts are there. These are named as either they are called posterior column tracts or they are called fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. Fasciculus means bundles of fibers. So fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus are responsible for two-touch discrimination. That means fine touch. If you touch two places at different points, you can easily identify with your eye closed that these are the 2 points where you're touching. So it's fine touch. It's not like a crude touch. You would say, oh, somebody is touching my elbow. You can precisely identify where the location of touch is. So fine touch, which is two-touch discrimination, vibration, and conscious proprioception, positioning sense with eyes closed, that your finger is up or down or your toe is up or down. This positioning sense that of your joints with your consciousness is the function of the dorsal column tract. There could be unconscious proprioception, which is during walking from your joints and from your muscles, there is positioning sense which is going to go to your higher center, which is unconscious without you knowing it. That is not the function of this tract. The function of this tract is conscious proprioception, two-touch discrimination, and vibration. Then you see the lateral wide column, and one of the big tracts in the lateral wide column is called lateral spinothalamic tract. It is going from spinal cord to thalamus and then to the cortex. The major function of this tract is pain and temperature. Then you have the two tracts in the lateral wide column, which are called anterior spinocerebellar and posterior spinocerebellar. And the name tells you that they are going from spinal cord to cerebellum. They are not going to go all the way to the cortex. So they are anterior and posterior spinocerebellar or ventral or dorsal spinocerebellar. So if you find these names, ventral and dorsal spinocerebellar, these are the same tracts. Their function is unconscious proprioception. That means that joint and tendon senses, which are unconsciously going to the cerebellum, they are the function of the tracts of anterior spinocerebellar and posterior spinocerebellar. Then there is a tract in the anterior wide column, which is called anterior spinothalamic. Again, it is a part of you can call it anterolateral system or anterolateral tracts, which are anterior spinothalamic and lateral spinothalamic. Anterior spinothalamic is responsible for crude touch and pressure. So there is fine touch, which is the function of the posterior column, and crude touch, which is vague sensation of touch, is the function of the anterior spinothalamic tract. There are other small sensory tracts like spinotactile tract, which is responsible for visual reflexes. There is a spino-olivary tract. There is a cuneo-cerebellar tract, the spino-reticular tracts. But these are small tracts, and we do not need to know their detailed pathways. You should know their names, that spino-olivary, spinotactile, spino-reticular. These are small sensory or ascending tracts with mostly we have unknown functions, and usually they are not clinically important. So the major ones which you need to understand in terms of their detailed pathways in the sensory tract are posterior column. Then you have the anterior lateral tracts, which are anterior spinothalamic and lateral spinothalamic, and the spinocerebellar tracts, which are going to go to the cerebellum, and they are responsible for unconscious proprioception. Then if you look at the motor tracts, the major one which is important in skill movements, your skill movements of your distal limbs, either holding something, writing something. These are all skilled movements. So the skill movements are controlled by these corticospinal tracts, and there are two parts of it. One is in the anterior wide column, which is called anterior corticospinal, and the other one, the bigger one, is the lateral corticospinal, which is in the lateral wide column. So, and both anterior corticospinal and lateral corticospinal, because they form an elevation in the medulla, which looks like a triangle, pyramid. That's why they are also called pyramidal tracts. So corticospinal tract or pyramidal tract means the same because they form the pyramids in the medulla. That's why they are called pyramidal tracts. All other motor tracts besides corticospinal are called extrapyramidal tracts. So there are some which facilitate flexor tone or flexor muscles, which are, for example, the rubrospinal. There is one which facilitate extensor muscles, which is the vestibulospinal. Tectospinal is responsible for visual reflexes. And then you have the medial and lateral reticulospinal tracts, which are important in terms of modulating the response of the lower motor neurons. So the medial and lateral reticulospinal, the tectospinal, the vestibulospinal, and anterior corticospinal, they all are located in the anterior wide column. In the lateral wide column, you have two motor tracts. One is the lateral corticospinal, and the other one is rubrospinal tract. Rubrospinal, as I said, it facilitates flexors. Vestibulospinal facilitate extensors. The medial and lateral reticulospinal tracts are important because they modulate the effects of the alpha motor neurons or gamma motor neurons, which are present in the anterior gray horn cells. So because these tracts are coming down, they modulate, either excitate or inhibit the lower motor neuron. So they have a function in modulating the response of the alpha motor neurons, which are and gamma motor neurons, which are present in the anterior gray horn cells. And then you have tectospinal, which is responsible for visual reflexes. So this is just an overview again about the tracks. So the major ones which you should remember at all times, these are the three which both ascending and descending. Among them, these three, if you understand these three well, most of the neurological problems related to spinal cord and tracts you would be able to get through. The major motor tract is corticospinal, and the two major the two major sensory systems. One is the dorsal column, which is called medial lemniscal system also. It is important for true touch discrimination, vibration sense, and the main pathway for tactile information, fine touch. So this is for fine touch, uh, vibration, and proprioception. This is the function of the medial lemniscus or the dorsal column tract or fasciculus gracilis cunatus. If you hear these terms, fasciculus gracilis cunatus means dorsal column medial lemniscal system. And the third one is the anterior lateral system, which include the anterior and lateral spinothalamic tract, mainly responsible for pain and temperature, and the anterior lateral anterior spinothalamic tract is responsible for crude touch and pressure. So let's before I start the pathway of the dorsal column tracts, which is fasciculus, gracilis, and cuneatus, you need to understand within the sensory system there are usually three sets of neurons. We call them first order, second order, and third order neurons. So we have three sets of neurons: first order, second order, third order. The cell bodies of the first order neurons for all sensory tracts is present in the dorsal root ganglia, which is outside the spinal cord. So in the dorsal root ganglia, you have cell bodies of the first order neuron. And the type of neurons there are pseudo unipolar. So they have a process coming out from the cell body, and then dividing into two. One going to the peripheral receptors, and then one portion of the axon is going into the spinal cord, and they would synapse either within the spinal cord in the gray matter, the spinal cord in the posterior horn, or they would ascend upwards to the medulla and synapse in the gray matter in the medulla. So there would be the first order neurons, the central pieces of them, they would enter the spinal cord and synapse in the gray horn cells, or they would ascend all the way up to medulla, where they would synapse in the gray matter in the medulla. The cell bodies of the second order are either present in the dorsal, the posterior gray horn cells of the spinal cord, or they are present at the level of medulla. And the characteristics of these second order neurons is that their axons will cross the midline. So they would decussate and they would move from, if they are entering from right side, they are moving to the left side of the spinal cord or the left side of the medulla. So cell bodies of the second order neurons either are present in the dorsal or the posterior gray horn cells of the spinal cord, or they are present at the level of medulla. And their axons are going to cross the midline and then ascend in the contralateral white column. So this is the characteristic of the second order sensory neurons. Now their axons will travel in the contralateral white column and ascend all the way up from the brainstem to the thalamus, and they would relay, the axons of the second order will relay in the cell bodies of the third order neurons. They would synapse with the cell bodies of the third order neurons, which are present in the thalamus. And there is a nucleus of the thalamus for the sensory tracts, and that's called ventro-posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. So just for your purposes at the moment, you can just remember this name: ventro-posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. This is the place where you have the cell bodies of the third order neurons. And their axons will travel and pass from the thalamus, pass through a space in the brain, which is called the internal capsule, and then go to the postcentral gyrus, which is the primary sensory area, where the third order neurons are going to end. So cell bodies of the first order are present in the dorsal root ganglia. They have pseudo-unipolar neurons, so their peripheral processes are going to the skin receptors. It could be free nerve endings, it could be mechanical receptors, it could be anything based on the type of tract you are talking about. Their central processes of the first order neurons will enter into the spinal cord. Either they would synapse in the posterior gray horn cells, which are the sensory neurons, or they would ascend in the white column, do not synapse in the spinal cord, ascend in the spinal cord in the white matter all the way up to medulla and synapse there. Once they synapse, the second order neurons, which are either the cell bodies which are present either in the spinal cord or in the medulla, their axons will cross the midline and ascend in the contralateral white column on the opposite white column. Okay. And then they would go all the way to the thalamus, where the cell bodies of the third order neurons are located. And this nucleus of the thalamus is called ventro-posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. From here, the fibers will pass through a space in the brain, which is called internal capsule, and then go to the post-central gyrus, which is the primary sensory area. Yes.
So, Doctor, if the third order neuron starts at the level of thalamus, or
At the cell bodies are at the level of thalamus, and their axons will go and then go to the post-central gyrus, which is the primary sensory area in the cerebral cortex.
And the second order starts at the level of spinal cord,
Or either in the spinal cord or at the level of medulla. That's the trick. You need to know where the cell bodies of the second order are present. They are present at the level of the spinal cord, or they are present at the level of medulla. Their characteristic is that their axons will cross the midline. So if the cell bodies are present on the right side, the axons will go to the left side. So they cross the midline and then ascend in the contralateral white column all the way up to the thalamus, where the second orders are going to synapse with the cell bodies of the third order neurons, which are present in the ventro-posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. Everybody clear? Yes.
What are the lateral and anterior, the lateral and anterior spinal tract?
Mhm. They are motor tracts. They are for the skill movements. So the lateral corticospinal and anterior corticospinal, they are motor tracts or descending tracts, and they are responsible for skill movements. Okay. Okay. So we start now the dorsal column tracts, and the dorsal column tracts are basically fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. Fasciculus gracilis is present throughout the length of the spinal cord. So you would find fasciculus gracilis throughout the length of the spinal cord. Fasciculus cuneatus in only upper thoracic and cervical segments of the spinal cord. Okay. Fasciculus gracilis throughout the length of the spinal cord, and fasciculus cuneatus only in the upper thoracic and cervical segments of the spinal cord. What is the function of the dorsal column? Two-touch discrimination, vibration, and conscious proprioception. Now, why fasciculus gracilis is present throughout the length of the spinal cord? Because it is taking these sensations from the coccygeal, sacral, and lumbar and the lower thoracic segments of the so if you are taking these sensations, the tract is located medially and it is going up. So it is present throughout the length of the spinal cord. The fasciculus cuneatus, because it is taking only the sensations from upper thoracic and cervical segments, it is only present in upper thoracic and cervical segments of the spinal cord. It is not present in the lower thoracic, lumbar, and sacral segments of the spinal cord, and it is located laterally. So medially located is fasciculus gracilis, laterally located is fasciculus cuneatus, because the fibers are adding as you are going up. The fibers are adding. From the lower part, they are located medially. From the upper part, they are located laterally.